Cecil Rhodes, serving as Prime Minister of the Cape Colony and already a wealthy and powerful mining magnate, viewed the crisis unfolding in the Transvaal as the perfect opportunity to extend British authority and seize control of the region's enormous mineral riches. His ambitions culminated in late 1895 with a reckless gamble that became infamous across the empire. Rhodes secretly organized what would be remembered as the Jameson Raid, a bold but disastrously ill-conceived invasion. The raid was entrusted to Dr. Leander Starr Jameson, a close ally of Rhodes, who led a column of just over 500 armed men drawn largely from the British South Africa Company. Crossing from Bechuanaland into the Transvaal, their mission was to ignite a revolt among the discontented Uitlanders in Johannesburg, foreign settlers who worked the gold mines but were denied political rights. The expectation was that this rebellion would justify British intervention. But the raid did not go according to plan. The Uitlanders, far from rising up, chose to remain quiet, leaving Jameson's men dangerously isolated deep in hostile territory. Boer commandos quickly surrounded the raiders, forcing them into a desperate standoff. On January 2, 1896, at Doornkop, Jameson's small force surrendered. The failed operation was a humiliation not only for Rhodes, who was compelled to resign from his office, but also for the British government, whose covert imperial ambitions had been laid bare for the world to see. The Boer republics, deeply angered by this violation, responded decisively. They embarked on an aggressive program of rearmament, purchasing modern weapons and expanding their commando forces. Whatever fragile trust had existed between the British authorities and the Boer leadership collapsed beyond repair. From that point forward, relations steadily deteriorated. Efforts to negotiate a settlement over the status of the Uitlanders proved fruitless. The arrival of Alfred Milner as Britain's new High Commissioner only made matters worse. Milner, like Rhodes, was a fervent imperialist who believed that British supremacy in southern Africa was both inevitable and desirable. To him, war seemed less a possibility to be avoided and more a necessary step in securing the region. When he sat down with President Paul Kruger of the Transvaal at the Bloemfontein Conference in 1899, the discussions collapsed quickly. No compromise could be reached, and while British troops gathered in preparation, diplomacy ground to a halt. Faced with these threatening buildups, the Transvaal turned to its fellow Afrikaners in the Orange Free State. United in cause, the two Boer republics presented Britain with an ultimatum on October 9, 1899. They demanded the withdrawal of British troops from their borders. London ignored the demand, and when the ultimatum expired, the Boers acted. On October 11th, they crossed into British territory, and the Second Boer War had officially begun. The British Empire entered the conflict at a disadvantage. Since the First Boer War almost 2 decades earlier, the British Army had modernized its equipment. Soldiers now carried Lee Metford bolt-action rifles in place of the older single-shot weapons, and the bright red coats that once made them stand had been replaced with khaki service uniforms better suited to the African landscape. But improved arms and uniforms could not conceal a glaring weakness: manpower. At the outbreak of hostilities, Britain had only about 10,600 troops stationed in South Africa. Most of these were scattered across garrisons with limited cavalry and artillery support. Recognizing the severity of the threat, the British began mobilizing reinforcements on an unprecedented scale. Over 47,000 men of the 1st Army Corps were assembled in Britain, complete with artillery batteries and machine guns, preparing to sail south. In addition, an advance force of 10,000 troops under General Sir George White was rushed into South Africa to shore up vulnerable positions. The stage was being set for a long and costly struggle. On the other side, the Boers were far from unprepared. The combined manpower of the Transvaal and Orange Free State amounted to more than 50,000 men, a figure bolstered by streams of foreign volunteers who came to fight alongside them. Unlike the professional regulars of the British Army, most Boer fighters were part of citizen commandos, men drawn from the farming communities who provided their own horses, rifles, and basic supplies. They wore no standardized uniforms, preferring their everyday earth-toned clothing that blended perfectly into the South African terrain. Their natural horsemanship, combined with remarkable skill as marksmen, gave them a deadly advantage in mobile warfare. Many carried modern rifles such as the Mauser, whose clip-loading mechanism and precision made it particularly effective at range. Lightly equipped and highly mobile, Boer commandos could strike quickly and vanish just as fast, a sharp contrast to the slower, more rigid British formations. Yet despite these advantages, the Boers faced challenges of their own. Coordinating large-scale offensive operations between two separate republics was slow and cumbersome. Valuable time slipped away as their leaders debated strategy and assembled their forces. By the time Boer commandos surged into Natal and the Cape Colony, British General George White had already fortified key defensive positions. The Boers' strategy in the opening phase mirrored their successful approach during the First Boer War: carry the fight into British territory, pin down garrisons through sieges, and encourage Afrikaners in the Cape to rebel against imperial authority. The goal was to force Britain into a position where negotiation seemed preferable to costly military escalation, all before reinforcements from across the empire could arrive in large numbers. In Natal, command of the Boer invasion fell to Piet Joubert, a seasoned veteran who had distinguished himself in the earlier conflict. Now 66 years old, Joubert was not the fiery commander he had once been, and in private he expressed doubts about the wisdom of going to war at all. His hesitancy, combined with early setbacks, weakened Boer momentum. On October 20th and 21st, Boer forces suffered defeats at Talana Hill and Elandslaagte. These reverses checked their advance and eroded confidence in Joubert's leadership. Tragically, just weeks later, Joubert was injured in battle and eventually succumbed to his wounds, depriving the Boer cause of an experienced leader. Yet even with Joubert's loss, the British were slow to exploit their opportunities. Rather than pressing forward, they hesitated, allowing Boer forces to tighten their grip. Commandos surrounded and laid siege to key towns, Ladysmith in Natal, and Mafeking and Kimberley in the Cape. These sieges became defining features of the early war, compelling the British High Command to focus nearly all available resources on relief efforts. In early November 1899, Britain's massive reinforcements finally began to land. The First Army Corps, under the command of General Sir Redvers Buller, disembarked in South Africa, joined by troops from across the colonies. With their arrival, the British prepared to launch a counter-offensive aimed at breaking the sieges and turning the tide of the war. But the Empire's initial response was marred by overconfidence and a dangerous underestimation of the Boer commandos. Relief columns were dispatched to the besieged towns, yet British soldiers found themselves in terrain they barely understood, facing an enemy who knew every hill, valley, and river crossing. Boer guerrilla tactics, ambushes, mobility, and precision rifle fire turned what seemed like straightforward relief operations into a series of bloody setbacks. One of the first blows came on November 15th, near the town of Chivli. A British armored train carrying troops and reconnaissance units fell into a well-planned Boer ambush. Commandos, aided by Italian volunteers, derailed the train with explosives and poured fire into the trapped soldiers. After a sharp firefight, the British survivors were forced to surrender. Among those captured was a young war correspondent named Winston Churchill, who would later rise to international prominence, but at that time was little more than an ambitious journalist. The raid, though small in scale, was a humiliation and a warning of what was to come. That warning was realized in devastating fashion during a single week in December 1899, remembered forever in Britain as Black Week. In the span of just a few days, the British Army suffered 3 disastrous defeats that shook the nation's confidence in its military. The first calamity struck on December 10th, at Stormberg in the Cape Colony. Lieutenant General Sir William Gataker, eager to regain the initiative, launched a night march against Boer positions. Poorly prepared and guided by unreliable scouts, his men became hopelessly lost, marching in circles through the dark. By daylight, they stumbled into the wrong location, exhausted and disorganized. Boer riflemen were waiting. Gataker's attack collapsed almost instantly, and more than 600 British soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured, while Boer casualties were negligible. The very next day, another British force met with disaster. At Magersfontein, south of Kimberley, Lieutenant General Lord Methuen was leading a column tasked with lifting the siege of Kimberley. His troops were already weary, having fought hard engagements at Belmont and the Modder River. Now, to reach their objective, they needed to dislodge Boer forces entrenched on a ridge commanded by General Piet Cronje. Believing the enemy's defenses were concentrated at the hilltop, Methuen ordered a night march with his Highland Brigade, intending to assault at dawn, but Cronje had cleverly moved his trench lines down to the base of the ridge. Hidden from artillery fire, his men waited silently. As the Highlanders trudged forward in dense formation through driving rain, dawn broke. Their commander, Major General Andrew Wauchope, led them directly into the killing zone. At the last moment, Boer riflemen unleashed a withering volley at close range, supported by artillery. The front ranks were cut down in seconds, and Wauchope himself fell mortally wounded. Chaos erupted as the Highland Brigade faltered, and attempts by other units to rally them only added to the carnage. By the time Methuen ordered a retreat, nearly 1,000 British soldiers had been lost, the field littered with dead and wounded. With Gataker's force shattered at Stormberg and Methuen's mauled at Magersfontein, the burden fell on General Buller himself. Determined to relieve Ladysmith, Buller led his troops into battle on December 15th along the Tugela River. But here too, the Boers had entrenched themselves in strong defensive positions. Buller's decision to launch a frontal assault proved disastrous. Under relentless rifle and artillery fire, the British attack quickly disintegrated. Recognizing the futility, Buller called off the assault, but not before suffering 900 casualties. In the span of just 1 week, Britain had endured 3 crushing defeats. Stormberg, Magersfontein, and Colenso revealed the grim reality: the Second Boer War would not be the short, triumphant campaign many in London had expected. Ladysmith was still under siege, and with Colenso added to the string of disasters, Britain faced the grim reality of a third major defeat in as many days. News of what came to be called Black Week rippled across the empire like a shockwave. 3 humiliations in less than 7 days, inflicted not by some great European power but by farmers and frontiersmen organized into citizen militias. For many in Britain, the memory of Majuba Hill in 1881 came rushing back. Once again, the British Army had underestimated its opponent, and once again Boer mobility, superior field craft, and deadly rifle fire had left Imperial troops bloodied and disoriented. Public outrage was immediate and ferocious. It was clear to nearly everyone that drastic changes in both leadership and strategy were required if the empire was to recover its honor and prevail. The government acted quickly. General Redvers Buller, whose repeated blunders had cost Britain dearly, was relieved of supreme command. In his place came Field Marshal Frederick Roberts, a commander of great renown whose service in India and Afghanistan had earned him both respect and trust. Roberts was accompanied by his Chief of Staff, General Herbert Kitchener, fresh from his triumph in the Sudan campaign. Kitchener, known for his meticulous planning and ruthless efficiency, would prove a decisive figure in reshaping the British war effort. While Buller remained in Natal, still tasked with breaking the siege of Ladysmith, Roberts and Kitchener devised a sweeping new plan of attack. Their aim was bold and clear: strike hard at the very heart of the Boer republics. Roberts concentrated his forces in the west, preparing for a massive flanking maneuver. The plan was to relieve Kimberley, where the garrison had been holding out under siege, and then trap General Piet Cronje's Boer army. With Cronje destroyed, the road would lie open to Bloemfontein, capital of the Orange Free State. Unlike the commanders who had stumbled through Black Week, Roberts and Kitchener were determined to learn from past mistakes. They understood that sending infantry in rigid frontal assaults against entrenched riflemen was a recipe for catastrophe. Instead, Roberts emphasized the use of cavalry and mounted infantry to counter Boer mobility. Kitchener, meanwhile, focused on reorganizing supply lines and tightening logistics, ensuring that the vast army could move with greater efficiency. Both men stressed the importance of reconnaissance, the careful use of cover, and more flexible tactics suited to the South African terrain. The transition was slow and uneven, but the army was beginning to adapt. The counter-offensive opened in February 1900. Roberts launched his great flanking march from the Modder River, bypassing the strong Boer positions at Magersfontein. His cavalry swept east, cutting through the Boer lines and racing toward Kimberley. On February 15th, after 124 long days of isolation, the siege of Kimberley was lifted. Cronje, recognizing his position at Magersfontein was now exposed, abandoned the trenches and retreated toward Bloemfontein. But the British pursued relentlessly. Cronje's retreating column was harried until it was cornered on the banks of the Modder River near Paardeberg Drift. Here Kitchener sought to turn the tables, encircling the Boer force in a siege of his own. The initial British assault on February 18th was costly, as waves of infantry charged entrenched Boer riflemen, suffering heavy casualties. But the cordon tightened. For 10 days the fighting raged, with British artillery raining shells upon Cronje's lager. Finally, on February 27th, the anniversary of Britain's humiliation at Majuba Hill, the tables were reversed. Surrounded and battered, Cronje surrendered with over 4,000 men. The victory at Paardeberg was a turning point, removing a substantial portion of the Boer army from the field and lifting British morale after months of despair. With Cronje captured, Roberts pressed on. His army advanced steadily, fighting off scattered Boer resistance. On March 13th, British troops entered Bloemfontein, capturing the Orange Free State's capital. Meanwhile, in Natal, General Buller, though still dogged by earlier failures, finally achieved success. After bloody setbacks at Spionkop and Valkrantz, he adopted a more careful and deliberate approach, bringing his overwhelming artillery to bear on the Boer defenses along the Tugela Heights. This time persistence paid off. On February 28th, Buller's forces broke through, relieving Ladysmith after 118 days under siege. The tide had shifted. Within a matter of weeks, the Empire had not only lifted the sieges of Kimberley, Ladysmith, and later Mafeking, but also seized the Orange Free State capital. For the first time since the war began, momentum was firmly with Britain. The relief of Mafeking became a particularly celebrated moment back home. The town had been besieged since the opening days of the war, defended with ingenuity and determination by Colonel Robert Baden-Powell. His garrison, though small, had used decoys and clever ruses to give the impression of greater strength. Holding out month after month, public attention in Britain fixated on the plight of Mafeking, and when word arrived that a relief column had finally broken through on May 17th, jubilations swept the empire. The term Mafeking, meaning wild public celebration, entered the language overnight. With communications secured and his forces reorganized, Roberts resumed the main advance. Marching north from Bloemfontein in early May, his columns steadily pressed the Boers back. Outnumbered and increasingly demoralized, the Republican forces could not halt the advance. On May 31st, Johannesburg fell. After brief resistance near Doornkop, the same site where Jameson's raid had met its ignominious end years earlier. Just days later, on June 5th, Roberts's army entered Pretoria, capital of the Transvaal. British prisoners were freed, and the Union Jack was raised over the government buildings. With both Boer capitals in British hands and their main field armies shattered, many in London believed the war to be effectively won. But the Boers were not finished. Though some laid down their arms, others resolved to fight on. Denied the ability to wage conventional battles, they shifted to a form of warfare in which they excelled: guerrilla resistance. Leaders like Christian de Wet, Louis Botha, and Koos de la Rey abandoned formal formations in favor of small, highly mobile commando units. Intimately familiar with the veld and its rugged terrain, they launched raids and ambushes that harassed British supply lines, struck at isolated posts, and melted away before larger forces could react. It was a war of constant movement, confusion, and sudden violence. For Roberts, and later Kitchener, who assumed overall command in November 1900, this new phase was maddening. Britain's vast armies were designed for set-piece battles, not for chasing elusive bands of mounted fighters. The commandos drew sustenance from the land and enjoyed the support of sympathetic rural populations, making them nearly impossible to eliminate outright. Gradually, the British adjusted. Large columns gave way to smaller, faster-moving mounted detachments. Colonial troops and newly raised yeomanry were recruited in increasing numbers, better able to adapt to the demands of mobile warfare. But mobility alone could not break the guerrillas. To sever the commandos from their lifelines, Britain turned to harsher methods. A scorched earth policy was implemented with brutal efficiency. Farms were burned, crops destroyed, livestock seized or slaughtered. The aim was to deprive Boer fighters of food and shelter. To control the landscape, Kitchener ordered the construction of thousands of blockhouses, small fortified posts of stone or corrugated iron, linked by miles of barbed wire. These networks of forts carved the veldt into grids, restricting movement and funneling Boer fighters into zones where British columns could close in. This systematic campaign squeezed the Boer resistance, but it carried a terrible human cost. As farms were destroyed, women, children, and the elderly were left destitute. To deal with the growing flood of displaced civilians, the British established concentration camps. Initially described as refuges for those who surrendered, in practice they became grim prisons. Families were forcibly removed from their land and herded into camps that were hastily built, poorly supplied, and dangerously unsanitary. The suffering inside these camps was appalling. Disease spread rapidly and food was often scarce. Around 28,000 Boer civilians, mostly women and children, perished from hunger, disease, and neglect. In separate camps for black Africans, conditions were equally dire, with an estimated 14,000 dying in confinement. These policies, intended to starve the commandos of support, inflicted devastation on the civilian population and remain one of the most tragic legacies of the war. By 1902, The weight of Britain's measures was beginning to tell. Boer commandos still struck where they could, and leaders like de Wet and de la Rey carried out daring raids, but overall their strength was waning. Supplies were exhausted, their support networks shattered, and the countryside was crisscrossed with British blockhouses. The dream of igniting a widespread Afrikaner rebellion in the Cape Colony had not come to pass. Even the most determined fighters began to recognize that continued resistance, however heroic, would only mean further ruin for their people. Reluctantly, Boer leaders opened the door to peace. In May 1902, representatives of the republics met with British officials, including Kitchener and Alfred Milner, at Vereeniging. The negotiations were tense. Many Boers clung to the hope of preserving some measure of independence, but Britain was firm. Full surrender was the only option. Fierce debates broke out among the Boer delegates. Christian de Wet urged the fight to continue, but men like Louis Botha and Jan Smuts, pragmatic and weary, argued that survival required compromise. After weeks of painful deliberation, the Treaty of Vereeniging was signed on May 31, 1902. The terms were harsh, but not without concessions. The Transvaal and Orange Free State would lose their independence, becoming colonies of the British Empire. Yet promises were made. Self-government would be granted in time. The Dutch language would be protected in schools and courts, and funds would be provided to help impoverished farmers rebuild. Britain also deferred the question of political rights for black Africans, leaving it in the hands of future white-controlled governments, a decision that would shape South Africa's history for generations to come. With the treaty signed, the Boer commandos laid down their arms. After nearly 3 years of brutal conflict, the Second Boer War was over. It had cost the Empire over 20,000 military dead and tens of thousands more wounded. For the Boers, the toll was even heavier, with not only battlefield losses but the appalling deaths in the concentration camps. The war left scars that would not fade quickly. For Britain, it was a sobering lesson in the limits of imperial power and in the need to adapt to new forms of warfare. For the Afrikaner people, it was both a defeat and a survival. Though their independence was gone, their identity endured, and within a decade they would see the creation of the Union of South Africa, a dominion within the empire where they retained significant influence. Yet, the exclusion of black South Africans from political life planted the seeds of deeper injustices still to come. The Second Boer War remains one of the most bitter and consequential conflicts of the late Victorian age, a clash of empire and republic, of conventional armies and guerrilla fighters, of ideals and ruthless realities. It was a war that began with overconfidence and humiliation, escalated into a grinding struggle, and ended with uneasy compromise, its echoes lingering long into the 20th century.